So earlier today, the Dow Jones lost about 800 points. S&P 500 lost a point and a half. NASDAQ lost a point and a half. And the interest rates for 20-year Treasury bills went up over I think it was 5.12%, increased pretty dramatically. When the stock market indexes go down, it's usually because people are selling off stocks. When people sell off stocks and the stock market goes down like that, it's usually because things are in upheaval and they typically look for someplace safe to kind of store their money for a little bit. Historically, that has been U.S. Treasuries, bonds. Why do bond rates go up? Because not enough people are bidding on them. Why? Because they are viewed as an unstable asset. Moody's downgraded the United States credit rating last week for the first time ever for Moody's. And globally, investors are looking at the stock market as a bad bet, and they're looking at the bond market as a bad bet as well. Not enough people are bidding on bonds. Therefore, in order to sell them, the rate goes higher so that the return is higher. When we refinance our debt, our national debt that we owe other countries, in many ways it's based on that rate, which is going up, which will cost us hundreds of billions of dollars. A loss of confidence in U.S. fiscal management after a credit downgrade or deficit concerns can cause both stocks and bonds to be sold off. Rates go up as investors seek safer or more stable assets outside of the United States. The broader implications: high treasury yields, meaning high bond interest rates, often translate into higher interest rates throughout the economy, raising costs for mortgages, consumer loans, business financing, cars. Global impact: if the safe haven status of U.S. assets is questioned, global investors may demand even higher yields to hold U.S. debt, further pressuring both the bond and the stock markets. These things are terrible in the best of times. We're in a global trade war, specifically a trade war with China. Japan owns over $1 trillion worth of our debt. China owns about $800 billion worth of our debt. If our debt no longer becomes a good investment or a reliable investment, and let's face it, we have a president who's many millions of complete fucking morons in this country elected because he's the business man. He does business. He knows how to do business. He's the business man. They think he's good at business. What's one of the main things that he uses when he was in business? He used debt. And what did he used to do with his debt? He would default on it and renegotiate that debt on terms that were much more favorable to him and much less favorable to the entities holding that debt. If he does that with our national debt, that's the ball game for the United States economy. He's already shredded all of our global alliances. Canada hates us, and they don't hate anybody. He's shredded our economic relationships around the globe. The global economic order is reordering itself without the United States. Economically, they want to drive all of us into poverty. And with the cuts, well, the virtual eradication of Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security's next up. There's no FEMA anymore. There's no real National Weather Service anymore. Hurricane season's right around the corner. He's firing 80% of the people at the VA. A third of the federal workers he's fired have been veterans. Their goal is to drive all of us into poverty and take away all of our health care. it's rapidly becoming a situation where it's like, will this country survive another 4 years of Donald Trump? To will individual Americans like actually physically survive another 4 years of Donald Trump? And it's not looking great.
And then secondly, would you support a millionaire tax?
I think it would be very disruptive because a lot of the millionaires would leave the country. You know, in the old days, they left states. They go from one state to the other. Now with transportation so quick and so easy, they leave countries. You'll lose a lot of money if you do that. That would, and other countries that have done it have lost a lot of people. They lose their wealthy people. That would be bad because the wealthy people pay the tax. Okay?
New tax bill going through Congress has two major problems. First, it is a tax cut to the wealthy while levying huge burdens on the poorest of households. First, I gotta start by noting this one, the exemption for the estate tax is now all the way up to $15 million, meaning the first $15 million of an estate goes tax-free. But look, they're also going to inflation adjust this exemption. I find it a little funny that the very wealthy inheritors, the people who don't work for their money, are getting an inflation adjustment, fine, but the working, poor, minimum wage earners are yet to see that. It's giving... Okay, let's hop to it. This is from the CBO. They're going to include major cuts to Medicaid and food assistance. We're talking around 11% to 20 and 30% respectively. This will result in higher incomes for the top 10%, but lower incomes for the bottom 10%. These are folks below the poverty line. But we should never rely on just one source. Let's go. The Tax Policy Center and Urban Institute micro-simulation model finds only those making $40,000 a year or more will see higher incomes, whereas everyone less than that is going to feel more pain. And we see the biggest income hike for those making more than $200,000 a year. Here's a third source. The Wharton budget model also shows a similar picture with massive income drops for the bottom quintile, the bottom 20%. And those only in the middle quintile and above experience the positive benefits of a tax cut. This bill is unique, as Mike Kongzal notes here. Check out the effect from the Bush tax cuts. Everybody got something. I mean, yes, it is regressive. The richest got the highest benefit, but like everybody got some tax cuts. And then look at the 2017 tax cut under Trump's first term. Everybody got some cuts, even though the cuts were more heavily felt at the higher end. Oh, and none of these analyses that I just cited are taking into account the new tariffs. Lower and middle incomes pay a higher proportion of the tariffs. I think the video's getting kind of long, so I gotta make another video talking about the deficit and what this does for fiscal responsibility.
What are you expecting out of the next 4 years?
What I'm expecting, and I want to underscore, I mean, you're quite right, but I want to underscore, I'm not predicting, I don't have that power, I don't think anybody does. I believe Mr. Trump is going to be overwhelmed by history. Nor is he alone in that. That has happened to most other political leaders. They, and often their adoring publics, overestimate how much they can do, how much they understand. So I expect him to be overwhelmed. Overwhelmed by the decline of the empire, which is continuing, by the mounting economic problems in the United States because of the declining empire in part, and because we have as a nation a level of ideological obfuscation, I'll be polite, that makes it hard for Americans to honestly face their problems and come to grips with them. And in some sense, that's our own fault as a people. But between that and the forces at work, Mr. Trump doesn't have the insights, and I don't just mean him, but his group, his team, or whatever you want to call it. They don't have the insights that I see. They don't have the tools that I can see to deal with the problems that I can see. So I think he will be overwhelmed. things will work out in a way he did not want and did not foresee. That certainly happened to Mr. Biden. It certainly happened to Mr. Trump at the end of his first race. And since he's a person given to doubling down, he tried to be more in the second time than he was in the first time, but along very similar lines, only more so. And I don't think that's going to solve any of the problems, except by accident. I'll go back to what I said at the beginning. He's going to be throwing Hail Mary passes often. And you know what happens? Most of the time, those don't work very well. Sometimes they do. And that's the best he can do. And that's not so different from others, but it's been my experience that the situation shapes the leader far more than the other way around. And I know that goes against more heroic notions, but that's what I see. The United States is going to have to come to terms with a reduced position in the world. It has been doing that poorly for some years now, so on one level, it's a continuation. But I am a Hegelian, and I understand that quantitative decline at a certain point becomes a qualitative shift. You know, with the old model, rising temperature of water until it, at a certain point, becomes gas. Or the other way, it becomes a solid with ice. At a certain point, the adjustment downward of the American economy is going to shake the society by imposing a qualitative shift. I see the United States, if you want to argue it a little differently, as headed in the direction of wealthy enclaves surrounded by a sea of people in pretty tough economic circumstances. That used to be the way the rest of the world, or much of it, looked. That's coming home to the United States.
That's interesting.
And I think Mr. Trump has cashed in on that phenomena. He's cashed in on the upset that this is already creating when you get hints of all of this. But he is still able to cash in on it politically.
This first 100 days of the Trump administration will go down in history as the greatest grift in the history of our economy in terms of the amount of money stolen and the size of it over the shortest period. Just some data here. Trump-affiliated entities have made at least $300 million in trading fees. The Trump family's net worth has increased by $3 billion, or $1 billion a month since he took office. Just some timeline. The Trump coin launched on a Friday night under cover of dark with all the news about the inauguration. By 3 a.m. on Sunday, it was valued at more than $70 billion, and there were a small number of investors who made large investments on a Friday. Maybe they got a tip or something. They made tens, if not hundreds of millions. And then over the course of the next couple weeks, about 800,000 smaller investors lost billions. This market manipulation, this what would technically be called insider trading by the SEC, we'll never know, because on April 8th, Trump's deputy attorney general ordered the DOJ's crypto fraud investigation arm to disband. Trump posted on Truth Social, "This is a great time to buy Donald Trump media at 9:37 a.m. Between 1 and 1:10 p.m., there was a huge increase in bullish zero-day S&P 500 call options. And then just 8 minutes later, Trump announced a 90-day pause on all of his tariffs, and the market soared almost 10%, one of the biggest one-day gains in history. So someone knew what was going on.
Of course they do. He calls them.
That's called insider trading. The market gained $4 trillion while Trump media closed up 23%, increased his net worth by $415 million. On April 23rd, Trump announced that the top holders of the Trump coin would win an exclusive dinner with him, and the coin surged over 60%. Just 58 wallets made more than $10 million apiece, totaling approximately $1.1 billion in gains. Meanwhile, 800,000 wallets of mostly smaller holders have lost money on their Trump coin. And it gets worse. Now the kids went on it. World Liberty Financial, a crypto firm run by Trump's sons, Eric and Don Jr., and they are entitled to 75% of its revenue. And now it's being leveraged to facilitate pardons for criminals. Justin Sun, a crypto billionaire, was under SEC investigation for securities fraud after investing $75 million in World Liberty Financial. Guess what, Kara? The SEC dismissed his case. This is what fucking infuriates me. I'm a realpolitik guy. I don't mind a little bit of corruption as long as it's good for all Americans. I don't mind a little bit of strong arming. But here's the problem, or the tragedy. If Trump brought half the competence, expertise, and elegance to governance as he does to grifting, the country would be in a much better place. We have a mob family running the country. That's the bad news. The worst thing is that Michael Corleone is managing the crime, and Fredo is managing the government. You are so good at stealing. Can you bring some of that elegance, that expertise to the government?
Life does not. Oh my God. Oh.
Almost all your taxes actually don't go to funding military bases on foreign soil, regardless of how catchy a song is. See, the federal government has to put out a bill every year that they vote on, which has a breakdown of what we spend our federal budget on. This is mandatory spending. The largest chunk is Social Security at 21%. But ignoring that, Medicare, Medicaid, and income security also make up the largest chunk. That right there in the discretionary spending is the defense bill, and that makes up 13%. 13% isn't almost all, and 30% of that 13 is just payroll, which means that 9% of the federal budget is going to buying more equipment. And an even smaller percentage of that is going to maintaining military bases on foreign soil. Here it is broken down by percents. Before I go on, I want to make it very clear. I'm not saying that the military shouldn't be audited or have less of our federal spending, but I can't stand when people lie or misrepresent data. You could point out that America spends 40% of the world's defense spending. We have 11 of the world's 21 aircraft carriers. We spend more than the next 10 countries combined. Those are all true things. Why not use those as your argument? Even if you add in veteran benefits and services, which are going to maintaining our VAs and keeping disabled veterans like myself and your grandfather alive, it still would bring it up to 18%, which is less than we spend on Social Security. But hey, that's just the federal government and the bills they vote on every year. What does the War Resisters League think with their graph estimating 2025? Weirdly not using trillions and putting thousands of billions. Well, they've added in everything that they think is the military, including things like NASA. Quite frankly, I don't think when people are complaining about the military, they're talking about NASA. But that brings them up to 21%, which is about what we spend on Social Security. And they're also estimating that past military, including things like veterans and the VA, they include our federal interest here, which they're arguing 80% or so is past wars. But even if you take all that and put that together, as they've done here, most of your spending goes to human resources and infrastructure. This is the only graph I could find that lends credence to the idea that almost all your taxes go to military spending, what they've called militarism, that they estimate at $1.14 trillion. But what they've done, if you read the rest of it, is they've left out Social Security, which is $1.4 trillion. So yeah, if you ignore what we spend most of our money on and lump a bunch of stuff in with the defense bill to call it militarism, I guess it looks pretty convincing. You can criticize stuff without using misleading information. And if you think the United States does not spend any money on its citizens, then you've been taken in by something called propaganda. Because if you go by total net social spending, the United States ranks second, only behind France. But that's only if you add in all the different stuff that you do for public services. If you're just going as public social spending, the United States comes in 21st. It's real easy to cherry pick data that makes your case, huh? Anyway, the United States isn't perfect, but it is not the flaming hellscape that social media would have you believe. We certainly spend too much money on our military, but it is not, in any sense of the word, almost all your taxes. And even if it were, it's not going to foreign soil. It's going to R&D and building tanks and shit. You have any idea how much one of our jets costs? It's ludicrous. Again, 11 of the world's 21 aircraft carriers. Do you consider an aircraft carrier a base on foreign soil, considering it's a floating city? Remember that propaganda goes both ways.
Where did the U.S. national debt come from? And isn't it really the fault of political party that I don't like. No, it's a bipartisan failure. The reason why we have the debt that we do, the fiscal situation that we do, and how we went from in 2001 being on track to pay off our national debts to now in 2025 having debt as a share of GDP of 120%. So I'm going to talk through how we got there and then where we are now and how it could affect the economy going forward. The best explanation that I've seen comes from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank here in DC that advocates for basically better fiscal decision-making by Congress, which they wrote this paper that came out last year called From Riches to Rags, Causes of Fiscal Deterioration Since 2001. One of the reasons why they picked 2001 is that in that year, the U.S. was in budget surplus, which might sound unfamiliar because we're so often in budget deficits. But we were in budget surplus, meaning that we collected more in taxes than we spent in any given year, and that surplus was then used to pay down the debt. And what CBO projected, just based on the current trajectory of taxing, spending, and surplus, that by 2009, we wouldn't have a national debt anymore. We were poised to pay it off completely. So how did we go from we are within spitting distance of completely paying off our debts to now it is the largest it has ever been, even when the economy is strong and our deficits run at around $2 trillion a year? Well, the report goes through it and basically itemizes each major legislation into taxing, spending, and emergency response to recessions to apportion out the debt increase. So what does that actually mean? So if you take the increase in debt, where it starts here in 2001 and it ends here in 2025, and you were to split it up into like 100% and say which percent is due to what, 28% comes from recession response. When the economy goes south, Congress has to kick into spending money to make sure that the economy doesn't deteriorate further, doesn't accelerate into some kind of depression or even worse recession. And it does so at a time when their own tax receipts go down because businesses aren't hiring, people are getting laid off, wages and income aren't growing. And so it's just kind of a necessary part of federal budgets that you're going to take a hit in recessions. The next largest chunk is spending. 33% comes from spending increases. The largest chunk, 37%, comes from tax cuts. Now, what the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget is very clear to point out is that the vast majority of legislation, like each recession bill, each tax bill, each spending bill, the vast majority of that legislation was all bipartisan. And I know that we all want to blame somebody else, but truly this was a bipartisan failure, that in every successive Congress, they have pushed up the debt and not done much to strengthen our fiscal position. So what are these taxes, spending, and recession response? Now, the tax side I've talked about before. We've had tax cuts in 2001 and 2003. And kind of like a backstory, if you were alive back then, you would know that this was a Bush campaign promise in the 2000 Bush versus Gore election. One of the big fights was, what do we do with the budget surplus? And Bush said he wanted to spend it on a tax cut, give it back to Americans. And that's exactly what he did twice over in 2001 and 2003. Those cuts were going to expire. So there was some kind of like minor continuation of them in 2009 and 2010, but they were made fully permanent in 2012. And then not even 5 years later in 2017, there was another tax cut. And those 2001, 2003, 2012, 2017, that's $7 trillion right there. And so that's where about the 37% of the increase comes from. It comes from these really large tax cuts. The 33% that comes from spending, a lot of it is expansions to Medicare and changes in Medicare program rules that alter how much Medicare spends in a year. So, in the early 2000s, we actually created a new part of Medicare, Medicare Part D, which has only grown kind of in incredible numbers since we've passed it. And then keep in mind, it's so easy to put things in the rear view and forget that they're there. But between 2001 and 2021, we were fighting a war in Afghanistan. And from 2003 to 2011, we were fighting a war in Iraq. And both of these conflicts are estimated to have cost somewhere between $2 and $3 trillion apiece. And a lot of the 33% of the debt that comes from spending, a lot of that is spending on wars. Not all of it, but a lot of it came from spending on wars, which are not part of the kind of spending equation anymore. Of course, big pieces of legislation that have increased spending recently were under the Biden administration, the CHIPS bill, the energy bill, and the infrastructure bill. I do feel bad for Biden because we tend to blame the entire problem on whoever last contributed to it. So actually, it's all his fault, I'm sure. But that is where the debt comes from. It's mainly bipartisan legislation. It's, some of it, I would say the 28% that's recessions. That's pretty forgivable. We want the government to go into a debt to keep the economy stable. But yeah, 33% spending and 37% tax cuts. And frankly, as an economist, I would say we don't have a lot to show for either of those things. It's not like poverty has gone away with debt at 120% of GDP. It's not like we don't have child poverty anymore, or that every kid gets, 3 square meals a day, no matter what in this country. We've taken on a lot of debt, and we can't necessarily say that the U.S. economy has transformed since 2001 into an unrecognizable, glowing picture of strength. And in fact, a lot of people will tell you that they're no better off despite all the machinations from the federal government and, the decreasing stability of its finances. That is the worst performance measure by far. The whole notion of taking on debt is it allows you to make investments to grow the economy. And it's not clear that we've made those investments. And at least from a social policy side, I would say we haven't. Well, the debt is coming up today of this, really not good position of $2 trillion deficits, just under $2 trillion, it's like 1.9, because Republicans in the House and Senate are trying to pass a $4 trillion tax cut, another tax cut following the $7 trillion that they've already passed previously, or that both parties have really passed previously. And they're going to pay for it with $1 trillion in spending cuts mainly to Medicaid and food stamps. They're going to kick around 10 million people off of Medicaid over a decade, which is 1 in 8 of the current beneficiaries. But they're going to borrow another $3 trillion. They're going to add another $3 trillion to the national debt. And credit rating agencies, which are private companies that assess the soundness and safeness of investments, have downgraded U.S. credit. In fact, one of them did it just this week, as the tax bill was being discussed, as a warning to say, do not pass this tax bill because the U.S. is not in a fiscal position to do so. You need to get your house in order. And what they pointed out in their downgrading and kind of the pernicious aspect of the U.S. debt, as long as people are willing to buy U.S. debt, they're buying U.S. bonds, it doesn't necessarily affect the economy in a negative way. But two things will happen the more debt we have. One, the more debt we have, the more interest we have to pay on it. So if I lend the government $100 on a 5-year bond, they do have to pay interest on the debt that they owe, just like you have to pay interest on the debt you owe. Well, what Moody's pointed out in the downgrade was that a third of federal spending within 10 years will go to paying down the debt, on interest payments on the debt. A third of all of our spending will just be interest on the debt. That absolutely limits what we're able to do and the kind of maneuverability we're able to have through things like recession if a third of our hands are completely tied to debt payments. So that's problem one. And the second problem with a large debt is that it makes the debt that we need, like the rest of the debt becomes harder to sell. Right? Like it's one thing if we were selling debt at a 1% interest rate and everybody was willing to buy it. But if the government's debt gets harder to sell and they have to pay more in interest for it, so this is what's been happening over the past 2 months, that the bond market for U.S. Treasury yields is going up and up. And these higher prices for U.S. Treasury bonds basically raise interest rates throughout the economy. And you can see it most clearly in the mortgage market. So everything that you borrow is in a market for debt that people buy. And if the safest investment in that market becomes more expensive, everything else does too. That's what we're risking by having such an unsustainable fiscal path, that we don't get the maneuverability that Congress needs, and we all have to pay more to borrow, including for things like cars and mortgages and student loans and what have you. That is where the debt came from. It is everybody's fault. What we need now, and this is the actual, clear, simple solution to the U.S. national debt, is for there to be an adult in the room.
Is American democracy under threat because of this stuff?
Under threat? Does it exist, Mark? I don't think it exists. It's a veneer. It's the end of the Roman Empire. You have the symbols, the iconography, and the language of a democracy, but internally corporations and oligarchs have seized all of the levers of power. I looked at this election as a battle between corporatists and oligarchs. Corporatists, the Democrats, they want something very different from oligarchs. Corporatists want stability, they want decorum, the kind of decorum that Obama had or Bush had, or Bush was an idiot, but at least he had some, they could clean him up a little bit. And Biden, whatever his cognitive failings were, because they want stability, especially in terms of trade agreements, because they make investments overseas. It takes a while for a return on a profit. Corporatists want something different from oligarchs. Oligarchs are about chaos. They're about, as Steve Bannon said, deconstructing the administrative state. Why? Because it is a pure form of rentier capitalism. And by that I mean that they make their money by setting up toll booths, Amazon, all of these digital media platforms. It's not about producing goods. And the more that the state is deconstructed, that's why they want to abolish the Department of Education, everything that we need as a civil society becomes privatized. And you see it in, I wrote a book called America, the Farewell Tour, begins in Scranton, Pennsylvania, where everything, the sewer system's privatized, the parking authority is privatized, the electricity is privatized, and of course they've jacked up the rates. And the services are not very good. And they want to privatize the post office so we can have a dysfunctional post office like the UK, which is privatized. And so that's what oligarchs want. And the oligarchs have won. They won. And but that's what this battle was about in terms of if we strip away its the kind of trivia or the cultural differences between the two parties. That at its core was what it's about. And so we have, as you point out, we have now an oligarchic system. But as Aristotle wrote, once you create an oligarchic system with those kinds of inequities, then your only two choices are tyranny or revolution.